Hi, everyone. Welcome to another SGA Civic Engagement and Social Action series. Today's conversation is sponsored by the Student Government Association and co-sponsored by the Office of Student Involvement. It's designed for students to learn about how they can engage in important issues that affect the world around them. The views in today's conversation are the opinions of the panelists only and do not reflect those of the university. As part of the series, we're also encouraging students to register to vote. DePaul utilizes a platform called TurboVote to assist students in registering to vote no matter what state they live in. You can get registered by visiting depaul.turbovote.org. In addition to getting registered, you can sign up to receive updates and reminders regarding deadlines for all elections in your area. With that, please join me in welcoming today's guest, Donald Bell. Hi, Donald.
Hello, good evening. Good evening, DePaul community.
Thank you for joining us this evening. So I'll start. The first question I had is, can you tell us a little bit about your experience with the Heartland Alliance and Affinity Community Services?
Okay, yes, I came to your recognition through the Heartland Alliance, which is a non-for-profit organization that has gone global and provides services in a lot of different areas. And particularly, I'm one of the benefactors of its housing division because I live at Town Hall Apartments at the northwest corner of Halsted and Addison. And what is important about Town Hall Apartments is that it's the fourth development in the United States that's designed to be LGBT senior friendly. So that's important because there are many places where members of the LGBT aging community are not welcome. And this provides a safe environment for us to live in at this stage of life and deal with the particular issues around this stage of life. So I was very blessed to be one of the initial residents asked to live here. And for that, I owe my appreciation to the limited partnership of the Heartland Alliance and the Center on Halsted, which is Chicago's LGBT Senior Center or Community Center, LGBT Community Center, I'm trying to say, and the Chicago Housing Authority. So those of us who are older, who need support in finding, adequate housing, livable housing, safe housing, who happen to be older members of the community benefit from the existence of this facility. So.
Yeah, Donald, it's great to hear about the center. I know DePaul, we hear about the center a lot, especially through our Office of Multicultural Student Success. They partner a whole lot. So it's great to hear that name pop up in a variety of different places too. And Donald, go ahead.
No. You go ahead with your question.
Well, I was going to say, for our viewers in our pre-show here, we were talking a little bit about your history, and it sounds like you've worked at a variety of different institutions, which I think, again, knowing a lot of our viewers today are DePaul students, I'm curious if you can just share a little bit about your journey and just tell us a little bit about what you've, done in higher education and just in advocacy work in general.
Sure, absolutely. Yes, I spent the bulk of my career in higher education administration in the area of student affairs. And I love student affairs because I found over the years that this is where so much of the significant part of a student's education takes place. In fact, higher ed research shows that many students are more likely to remember their first resident advisor than they are their first professor. So the things that happen in the co-curricular environment are really important. And I'm particularly excited about the fact that this is a discussion around civic engagement because it's very important that students spend this time examining and developing their own values around civic involvement and make some commitment for it for their lifetimes. I can tell you that I'm 71 years old, and I was a graduate student in the late 60s and the early 70s during a very tumultuous time in American history where we were identified basically as the first youth generation because we were the first ones as boomers, and I am a lead edge baby boomer, I confess, to actually question some of the social norms that existed, particularly those around race and gender and sexual orientation and gender identity and class. It's in our time that movements like opposition to the war, the civil rights movement, the dawning of the women's movement, the second wave of the women's movement, and the gay rights movement, all of these things happened, parts of the labor movement. And so we were challenged to question those values that we had grown up with, because as boomers, we were the sons and daughters of the greatest generation, people who had been born in the time and survived the Great Depression of the early 20th century and the Great War of the middle 20th century, and who'd come back, to a United States that was changing significantly as we were suburbanizing and all. So there was a lot of movement and all. And our most significant cultural influence for my generation was pretty much based on a Walt Disney-esque type culture that encouraged us to believe tremendous amounts of myths about our country. And we began to question those things in the 60s when we were in college, when all of these great movements were going on. And so we stepped away. And if you ever want to take a dip into history, just read some of the events that were happening around 1968. In my lifetime, 1968 was probably the most significant transitional year other than 2020. And so you live now in 2020, and all of the issues that you are dealing with and all of the things that you're struggling with resonate with people of my age, as we are involved now in a total change, a sea change in our society, what it has been and what it will be. So that's basically my history on that. And all of those movements were very much a part of my life, of course. As an African American, I was one of a few people who were privileged to go not just away to a resident university, but to go to majority universities. I went to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and at the time, there were fewer than 150 African Americans on a campus of nearly 60,000 students when you consider the graduate and professional students. And yet African Americans composed only 0.5% of the student body. Now, we as members of the citizens of the state of Illinois certainly didn't get any tax remission on the fact that we were not fully served by our state institutions, but our state institutions did not serve us well. And race was a huge issue. At the time that I went, students had only been allowed to live in the residence halls. Black students had only lived in the residence halls for 5 years. And that came after a consent decree had been filed and established in Champaign. Even though my campus was considered the Greek capital of the world with more chapter houses than any other university in the world, there were no Black fraternities with houses, and I was not permitted to join any of the 57 houses that happened to be all white. And in addition to that, I entered a class of 400 to study architecture, and there was me and 2 women, and the 3 of us were excluded out of our classes, and we were told that there was no place for us in the curriculum and no place for us in the profession. And that pretty much tends to be true even today, when in all of the United States, only 0.8% of registered architects are African American, and only 0.2% are African American women. So these kinds of issues have been around for a long, long time. So they were very important to me, very personal to me, and very much a part of what I did. I was a high school student body president. I was involved in student government at the university, and participation in student government and college activities and organizations is very important, because all of that is about reinforcing your role as a citizen. You participate to the community, but you also take on part of the responsibility for the governance of that community. And you go from that at an immediate level from school to a much larger role as you take on your responsibility in society. Now, when I was an undergrad, we were fighting to reduce the voting age from 21 to 18.
Mm-hmm.
And the justification that we were using was that if we were old enough to fight in a war,
Right.
we were
Yeah.
old enough to have some role in the governance of our society.
Absolutely.
And we did that, and we finally won that. But what happened in our experience, and I'm sure a lot of people repeat it back to those of you who are young now, is, well, young people have a lot of passion, but they don't follow through with voting. So I'm urging you, please, to register and to vote. Make your stake in your civic authority and position in society right now.
Yeah. Donald, there was you're fine. There was so much, and I was like, oh my, I wanted you to keep going because you were saying it was just such a powerful story. And I mean, there were so many things I resonated with. And I think in particular, like one of the things that you started talking to, like when you started talking about your journey, that I think really could resonate with our students is it's college in particular during this time. It's both this time where students are exploring their own identity and figuring out who they are, but especially, and I mean, you talked about it at the end of the 60s, early 70s, and I think our students are figuring it out today too. They're also trying to be this voice and this advocate for change, for positive change, and to help shape their world in this really dynamic and dramatic way, right? Because there's so much that they need to work on. So I just loved hearing, and it, I mean, we can't talk about it enough. It's hard enough to be a college student, let alone a college student in a pandemic during this time where we're spotlighting the racial injustices. So yeah, I just really appreciated that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And may I say that these are tough times to be a college student. This is a tough time to be young, because those demarcations that we would normally have of your life and your life expectancy, of course, you can't have during the time of COVID. You're not on campus full time in person. There are no athletics, there are no traditional events, up to and including commencements and convocations. So you don't have those demarcations of your advancement. But there are some things that you do have that are very important, and that is you have an affiliation and an interaction with one another. And even if you can't do it in person, you can do it through social media. You could do it like we did old school with the telephone or whatever. You can talk to each other. And this is such a significant part of your education. It may sound like I hated my time at U of I, and I didn't hate it. It was challenging. But there are two things that I realized very, very early. One is the privilege of going for college education and the opportunity to fight for that experience, not to be limited to vocational training, but to encompass my full development as a person. U of I opened the world to me. So this kid from the South Side and the South suburbs, can go anywhere and do anything because of that experience. I got a chance to question my values and my views of the world, and to enter into major discussions, not only with with fantastic faculty members and other resources that were brought to campus, but with my fellow students. And that's a resource that you should really value too. You have the chance to grow and to question and to learn together. So this is your first group of real compatriots who can go with you through your lifetime if that's how things are lucky enough to unfold. But this is where you question where you are and what you learn the value of your life experiences. And this is what reinforces your role in society. We live in the age of a mantra that speaks about making America great again. Well, I question that. I really disagree with that, because it's not about America being great at some other time, because it never was. But I do believe, as a descendant of indigenous people, of enslaved people, and as an ally of immigrant and refugee populations, that America has tremendous potential. And it will be what we make it. And we are at one of those significant times in history, with an election coming up, where we're going to have to decide what our collective values are, how we want to relate to each other as human beings, and what place we want to have in society, globally, and what we want to do in stewardship for our planet. There's no planet B. This is the only one. We are all interrelated. And how do we deal with that? So it's a challenging time, but it's also an exciting time. And from the old youth generation, I say to you, the new and contemporary youth generation, use this time. This is such an important time that you live in, and you are so important, because you will determine whether we succeed as people, whether we succeed on this planet, and whether this 244-year-old experiment called democracy is going to live. And it all rests with you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. Something that really resonated with me that you mentioned was how, despite being a minority in like UIUC, like you mentioned, and other communities where you really identified as a marginalized community, and worked hard to get your voice to be heard, and get people to support your community and the identities that you identify with. So a question I had was, how do you take space? I think that's a big question that I hear a lot, is making space, and also for others, but also taking space, and making sure that your voice is heard and in the table, and not just heard, but listened to. I think those are two things that distinguish, and how to work with others who have differing opinions with you.
Well, I'll tell you this. I certainly can hear varying opinions without being emotionally involved in what people are saying. My views are hard-earned, but they are not hardwired, and I'm constantly open to education. I think that my presence here today, even though I'm doing the lion's share of the talking, is to take away the feedback that I get from this group. And everyone who can see me on the screen, and because of my vision, I use the screen where I only see a very few people. But everyone, no matter which one of those little Brady Bunch boxes you occupy, has something to teach me, or something that I'm open to, and your existence enhances my existence. So that's one of the things that I know. But as a product of growing older, I certainly own my identity a lot more, because I've had to fight for it. And believe me, there have been life and death issues around my being Black, around my being gay, around my not being a man of privilege in terms of money. I'm the the son of parents who were amongst the first African Americans hired to work in the transit system. That was Black middle class in my time, and I'm proud of that. I'm proud of them and proud of the commitments that they made to me. But yeah, I don't know a lot of privilege personally in terms of great wealth or whatever. But that doesn't mean that I value myself any less because I come from great roots, and I'm a survivor. And there are certain things that I feel entitled to. I am entitled to my personhood. I'm even entitled to the curmudgeonliness that I've acquired as an older man because I paid for it. So that's how I occupy my space.
Yeah. Yeah. Donald, I love that phrase of like, what was it? I'm not hardwired, but my lessons have been hard earned. I think that's,
Absolutely.
yeah. Well, and I think it's so important for students to remember, especially like that mantra and that mentality. One of the things I feel like I oftentimes face in my job is like there has been, I think because of social media and because of some of these, the way that our society has changed, it feel like conversation has slowed. And I think it's more important than ever to lean into conversations with people and to like talk with people about differing opinions because people are, it's like you said, like, I think I'm an eternal optimist, and I believe that everybody has a little bit of good in them. We just have to give them the chance to amplify that and figure out how to like get that going for them, right? And like the only way that we start to do that is really through that conversation. So I think, my question would be, and particularly because, so I guess that's kind of a reflection that I have, but leading into my question, I really appreciate, especially with you, you've talked so much about your experiences in the Chicagoland area. And this, so I'm curious if you might have any advice for our students who are looking to, get civically engaged or become socially active for the first time, particularly in Chicago. How should they explore that? What advice might you have for them as they're starting that journey?
Well, I think, and of course, as I'm a third generation native Chicagoan, and so I've been here a long time. My family's been here a long time. My grandpa migrated to Chicago before the turn of the 20th century. That's a long time, and if you're going to get involved in Chicago or any place else, learn the history and the culture and the legacy of that place. Chicago is a distinctive place, and I won't make your ears bleed by going into that, but I'm a real Chicagophile. So and it's a wonderful history. But once you learn its history, then learn its cultures, learn how people relate. There is a distinct thing called a Chicagoan, but there's a distinct thing called a Bostonian. There's a distinct thing called, somebody from Mattoon, Illinois, which is a little bit tiny town. You know, a place means more than geographic location. It also means history and culture. So whatever you're going to get involved in, learn those things and become a part of that community. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to have all of the same values, but whenever you run into people whose values are different from yours, then there's an opportunity for exchange and for learning. And it also helps you to clarify what your values are and to practice expressing what they are. And after you've done that, after there's been discussion, after there have been exchanges, if the values don't agree, then find a civil way of expressing that. I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. But disagreement does not and should not always result in conflict. And that's very important. I think that as we get through this election and through this era, which will go on past the election, and hopefully the inauguration of a new president, there will be a lot of residual issues that Americans have to resolve. There will be lots of issues of how we occupy, this plot called the United States together.
Mhm.
And it behooves us all to find a way to civilly, as well as civically, but civilly interact with each other, because the goal is not conflict. The goal is to enhance commonality that does not demand that we all look alike or feel alike, but that we can all share the same space, both physical and social space together.
Yeah, I agree. I think what's hard also, I don't know if any other young people agree with me, but something that I struggle with is when I disagree with someone,
Mhm.
specifically older than me.
Mhm.
I have, I, a lot of, it's really ingrained in my head, respect. And I think
Mhm.
something that I kind of find a fault in is that I prioritize respect so much so to the point
Mhm.
where I'm not committing myself to the discussion or the conversation, and I'm letting things that I disagree with slip by
Mhm.
because I'm trying not to be disrespectful, which maybe it's because I'm young, or maybe it's because the culture that I grew up in really emphasizes the need for respect, and that those who are older than you have more experience and
Mhm.
sometimes are automatically correct, which I disagree with, but it's hard maneuvering with that. So I guess what would be your advice? Really trying to balance respect while also still
Mhm.
um, disagreeing.
I hear you. Um, and let me talk about us old birds. Um, and you'll notice in my conversation that I intentionally use those things that are sometimes ageist and off-putting or denied by people of my age group, because we live in a cultural society that dishonors aging, and we spend our whole lives worrying about not being young again. And that starts very early, as you will find in your contemporaries. Somebody will have a birthday and they'll be crying because they're feeling so old. And how old are you? Well, I just turned 20, or I just turned 25, a quarter of a century, and they sort of fall apart. But um, when you're talking to older people, in your head, remember this, um, that you owe everybody civility, but you don't have to be exploited by an assumption of power or legitimacy just because a person is older. You know, what we have to say may not be right, or may be questionable, or may not fit you. And there's a civil way to express that, and it should be received civilly. Don't let older people use the power of age to take away your voice. you know Now understand that we all have only lived as long as we've lived, so of course there are different experiences. What you call back in the day, I called, oh my god, that just happened yesterday. And you know and we have some allegiance to our times, you know but it behooves everybody, even those of us who are older, to be open to the changes of time, because one of the things that's inevitable is that everything will change. It'll not be the same, and it's difficult, especially if we love our time, to think that anything as good as our time could ever come around again. You know, um, you know, People talk about young people today, but I mean, we were into being young. I mean, that's what Woodstock, that's what all of our things were all about. We had hit songs like "My Generation" that said things like "I hope I die before I'm too old" and things like that, which we grew out of, but but that happens. But yeah, just because I'm 71 and you might be 20 or whatever doesn't mean that you lose legitimacy for your life's experience and what you have gained from your life experience. And hopefully we can talk about those things. And that will be good for both of us, because If I start losing input from people who are 17, from my grandchildren who are 3, whatever, then I stop living, because I stop growing. And we all live until we die. Some of us physically die, but some of us die before we even die, because we stop growing, because we stop inquiring, because we stop exchanging in communication. So you hold your ground, and that'll be practice for you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I know we're a little bit over time, but I feel like
sorry.
oh no, no worries, Donald, don't even worry about it. Luckily, with the great part about a stream, nobody's coming on after us, so we can take as long as we need to.
Okay.
But I think the other thing I feel compelled to add about this, that I think piggybacks on what Donald's saying a lot, is one of the things that I will always say is that silence and neutrality favor the side of the oppressor.
Absolutely.
And I think, like, while on the one hand, I think particularly when we're talking to folks who are older, we do try and be respectful, but we're not only talking to that person, we're also talking to all of the people around us, and our silence speaks just as loud as our comments, So I think that we can do it, and I really appreciate, Donald, what you said about, like, doing it civilly. Like, you can call out these issues without holding a protest sign while you're doing it. The protest signs are essential, but we can also enter into this dialogue and say, and call these things out and say, like, hey, we shouldn't be talking about this way, or, like, that's not, like, I don't agree with that. And you can engage in that conversation. And I think, like, that's one thing that especially in the last 4 years, we've just gotten away from that. And, like, people are so afraid that everything's going to turn into a massive event, that, like, we've just gotten away from that civility and dialogue. And I think it's really, really important for us to continue to have those conversations. And, I think, Alyssa, for you, for any students listening, I know it's hard to sometimes stand up and say it, but, like, often, unless it's like a loved one that you've got to see all the time, there might be a chance you're not going to see that person again too, right? So say it and stand your ground. Like, you have to live with how you interact with the world. So if you are so compelled and have that courage, I always encourage people to say something, so that, because we just shouldn't, silence is taken as acceptance a lot of times.
Right. I don't think that you owe your voice to anyone else. Don't let anyone take your voice. But on the other hand, though, I think it's important that we all have an investment in each other when we're in exchanges, particularly where there's tremendous amount of disagreement. Even if there's passionate disagreement, remember, the goal is to connect to the other person and to honor that person's humanity, not to vanquish the other person. This isn't about competition. This is ultimately about cooperation, because that's the only way we're all going to make it, is together.
Thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your experience and sharing all the advice you had. And I know everyone here who's listening and watching in is also really appreciative of all the words of wisdom that you had to share with us. So thank you for all of that. I also wanted to remind everyone watching that SGA meets weekly on Thursdays at 6 p.m. Not this week, though, because it's midterms week. So good luck to everyone who is in the middle of midterms. And also, please follow us on social media and join us next Tuesday. And remember to vote. Have a nice night.